Good evening. I'm Jenny Lawrence, a former trustee and longtime member of the library, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tom Chaffin, who will talk about his new book, Odyssey, Young Charles Darwin, the Beagle, and the Voyage that Changed the World. Before we begin, a word about the library, which was founded in 1754. In its 268 years, the library has closed its doors only 3 times. First, during the American Revolution, then briefly in a yellow fever outbreak in 1803, and finally during COVID's 3-month lockdown in 2020. The library heroically continued operations remotely through this pandemic, thanks to Carolyn Waters and her resilient staff. As we emerge from our COVID cocoons, many of us are thinking of where we want to travel again. But given the war in Ukraine and with COVID still very much abroad in the world, before we dust off our roller bags, renew our KTN numbers and global entry documents, this might well be the best moment to join Tom tonight and journey around the world with Charles Darwin. Not the iconic image most of us have of him as an old man with a bushy white beard, but a tall, exuberant 22-year-old fresh out of Cambridge, destined for the clergy, who joins a surveying expedition to South America on the H.M.S. Beagle. It's December 1831. Under his arm, he carries aboard 2 very influential titles, Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative and the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principle of Geology. Not your usual fare for a budding country vicar. Over the next 5 years, we will see through young Darwin's eyes the wonders of the natural world, a vivid, you are there narrative. Tom's previous books have followed a similar theme, journeys based on journals, letters, first-hand documents by young protagonists. In 2002, Pathfinder, John Charles Fremont and the Course of American Empire, Tom spoke at the library at the time about Fremont's exploration of the Trans-Mississippi West. In 2014, Giant's Causeway, Frederick Douglass's Irish Odyssey and the Making of an American Visionary, or in 2019, Revolutionary Brothers, Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the friendship that helped forge 2 nations. Tom has an MA in American Studies from NYU and a PhD in history from Emory. He has taught history and writing at various universities. In his work as a journalist, his writings have been published in Time, Harper's, The Nation, the Oxford American, and Natural History magazine, which is where I first met Tom in 1998 when we published his conversation with Eugene Odum, known as the father of ecology. At that time, Tom had just published his first book, Fatal Glory, Narcisco Lopez and the First Clandestine War Against Cuba. Odyssey is Tom's 8th book. In its epilogue, a last entry from the Beagle diary, young Darwin recommends a man travel to distant places, quote, to teach him good-humored patience, unselfishness, the habit of acting for himself, and of making the best of everything. He sounds a bit wistful here, regretting the end to this odyssey, to this life of high adventure and discovery. I suspect you will feel the same way after tonight. Please welcome Tom Chaffin.
I wanted to thank Jenny for her kind words of introduction. I also wanted to likewise thank Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, everyone else who helped to organize this evening's program, and for everyone participating remotely. I thank you for your time and for your interest in my new book, Odyssey, Young Charles Darwin, The Beagle, and the Voyage that Changed the World. I have fond memories of my last appearance before the New York Society Library when I spoke about Pathfinder, my biography of John Fremont. Like Darwin, I might add, another scientific explorer who idolized the Prussian explorer Alexander von Humboldt. On occasions like tonight's, I try to bear in mind what has become for me a favorite admonition concerning the virtues of brevity. No doubt some of you know the line. It comes from Samuel Johnson, and it concerns Darwin's favorite poet, John Milton, whose works Darwin carried on all of his many overland excursions away from the Beagle. Dr. Johnson's comment came after his first reading of Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost. He said, "No one would have wished it longer." So I'll try to keep that admonishment in mind this evening, but I do want to tell you about my book, otherwise known around my house as my pandemic lockdown project. Charles Darwin lived from 1809 to 1882. He first saw the light of day in the small town of Shrewsbury, England, where he was born on February 12, 1809. That same day, thousands of miles to the west, in a rough-hewn log cabin in Kentucky, the infant Abraham Lincoln also first saw the light of day. Of the circumstances associated with the two men's respective births, however, those attending Darwin's could not have been more propitious than those of Lincoln's humble origins. Charles was the fifth of 6 children born to physician and investor Robert Waring Darwin and his wife Susanna, daughter of industrial ceramics magnate Josiah Wedgwood. Shrewsbury lies in Shropshire, then and today a landlocked, largely rural county in England's West Midlands. In Shrewsbury, Robert Darwin prospered through a medical practice that served prominent families in the area. Prudent investments augmented his wealth, stocks in railroads and canals, and ownership of local rental properties. Charles' mother died when he was 8 years old. Afterwards, he grew up in a household run by a matriarchy composed of his 3 older teenage sisters. Charles grew up there with insatiable curiosities, mostly concerning the rural natural world that surrounded him. Indeed, during those years, he compulsively collected, among other items, birds' eggs, insects, postage stamps, and rocks. However, in the local private boarding school that he attended, and later at Edinburgh and Cambridge universities, he proved himself an indifferent student. By now, in popular imagination, as in this photograph of the scientist taken 4 years before his death, the face of Charles Darwin comes to us wizened with lines of age and framed by the Old Testament's prophet beard by which the world in 1859 first came to know him. That was the year when, at the age of 50, he published his groundbreaking book on the origin of species. To be sure, we have scores of contemporary photographs of the scientists from that era and later, many of them photographs. By contrast, we have but 2 portraits of Charles, neither of them photographs rendered before his 30th year. But despite that shortage of youthful portraits, without Darwin's travels between 1831 and 1836 aboard H.M.S. Beagle, he likely would never have written The Origin of Species. According to popular lore, sailing aboard the Beagle, Darwin visited the Pacific Ocean's remote Galapagos Islands. There he noticed some interesting tortoises and birds, and voila, then and there his soon famous theory burst into his head, after which he returned to England and promptly wrote Origin of Species. As Darwin himself put it in his posthumously published autobiography, the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most interesting event in my life and has determined my whole career. In that autobiography, written in Darwin's later years, he reflected on the qualities that enabled his success as a scientist. I think I am superior to the common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention and in observing them carefully. My industry has been nearly as great as it could have been in the observation and collection of facts. From my early youth, I have had the strongest desire to understand or explain whatever I observed, that is, to group all facts under some general laws. These causes combined have given me the patience to reflect or ponder for any number of years over any unexplained problem. Even so, as the poet Homer observes in the Odyssey, quote, "The gods don't hand out all of their gifts at once." In his autobiography, Darwin also assessed the price paid for the intellectual attainments of his later years. a price that included the loss of the artistic pleasures of his youth. My mind has changed during the last 20 or 30 years, he lamented. Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds, such as the works of Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, gave me great pleasure. Moreover, he added, I have almost lost my taste for pictures or music. Music, formerly a source of great pleasure, generally sets me thinking too energetically on what I have been at work on instead of giving me pleasure. Indeed, as I conducted research for my own book and discovered these often sharp demarcations between Darwin's youth and later years, I realized that they've led to a host of misconceptions concerning his life and works. And for this evening's present purposes, I've distilled some of those misconceptions into a list of 5. Let me begin with the one that heads my list. Misconception number 1, that the Beagle was dispatched to the Galapagos on a scientific expedition. Well, while Darwin's Beagle travels did shape his career as a scientist, the purposes of that expedition were, in truth, primarily commercial, economic, and political, and only inadvertently scientific. The Beagle's now famous 5-week call in the Galapagos, in fact, belonged to a 5-year global British Navy surveying expedition. More specifically, the Beagle had been commissioned to conduct marine surveys of selected coastlines and ports, mainly in South America. Britain, during those years, was competing with various European states as well as the United States for increased trade with Portugal's and Spain's former colonies, by then newly independent states. And for British officials, that competition demanded updated maps of those and other waters, nautical charts whose production required fresh marine surveys. Misconception number 2. Darwin served aboard the Beagle as the ship's official naturalist. Well, it's true that Darwin, by the conclusion of the Beagle's voyage, was informally recognized as the ship's naturalist. In truth, however, he played no formal role aboard the Beagle, nor in its survey work. When the Beagle departed England, Darwin was a 22-year-old aspiring but unknown naturalist, and at that, one who hoped to make his name as a geologist, not as a biologist. His invitation to accompany the voyage came from the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy, who had served on an earlier global survey involving the Beagle and another ship. During that voyage, the expedition's original commander, overcome by depression during an anchorage at Tierra del Fuego, had locked himself in his cabin and put a bullet in his head. For Fitzroy, who ultimately replaced the deceased commander and who himself was subject to depression with a recent suicide in his own family, the late captain's death served as a cautionary tale. Thus, soon after learning that he was to command a second expedition to many of the same destinations, Fitzroy, to relieve the isolation that otherwise would accompany that command, struck upon an idea. Why not invite a civilian to accompany the voyage? Someone outside the ship's chain of command with whom he might share his dinner table. Even better, find one who shared his interest in natural history. Such regular company, Fitzroy reasoned, might lessen his own odds of replicating his predecessor's downward spiral. Misconception number 3. The author of Voyage of the Beagle spent most of those 5 years of travel at sea. Well, in Darwin's case, to call his 5 years of Beagle-associated travel a voyage is misleading. In the end, he actually spent 3/5 of those 5 years of travels on land, 3 years and 3 months on land versus a total of 535 days on water. How was that, you might ask? Well, as an aspiring naturalist and determined to maximize opportunities to collect natural specimens, Darwin accompanied the survey expedition with the understanding that he would be allowed to leave the ship at will. Typically, his overland travels, conducted with hireling local guides after arranging to meet the Beagle at another port, lasted days, weeks, or even months. So why, if Darwin spent most of his time on land during those years, did he entitle his account of it the Voyage of the Beagle? The simple answer is he didn't. Darwin's account of his Beagle travels, originally published in 1839 under the bland title Journal and Remarks, belonged to a 3-volume quasi-official account of the by then 2 global survey expeditions with which the Beagle had been associated. Not until 1905, decades after its author's death, did the book appear under the title by which later readers came to cherish it, The Voyage of the Beagle. As a side note, if I may digress, Darwin's contribution to the multi-volume Beagle publication project, his volume, now known as Voyage of the Beagle, drew on a lively diary that he kept during his travels. Compelling writing fills many of Voyages of the Beagle's pages. Even so, for reasons of concision and content, about half of his diary's words failed to make it into the published book. Most particularly, Darwin excluded non-survey related topics, personal tribulations, and materials that Captain Fitzroy, who oversaw the project, might deem irrelevant, frivolous, offensive, or for proprietary reasons wanted to rope off for himself to describe. Typifying that deference was Darwin's reference to a noteworthy visit to Tierra del Fuego. "We stayed there 5 days," Darwin wrote in Voyage of the Beagle. "Captain Fitzroy has given an account of all the interesting events there which happened." As Oscar Hammerstein might say, it's good to be the captain. Additionally, in Voyage of the Beagle, because the ship made repeated visits to several anchorages, Darwin strayed from his diary's chronological structure to organize Voyage of the Beagle's chapters by place. In the end, those and other editorial decisions, in my view, sacrificed much of his diary's drama, narrative cohesion, candor, topical breadth, and intimacy, the latter what Darwin called the chit-chat details of my journals. In creating my own narrative of Darwin's travels, I elected to tap into the full breadth of his writings, both published and unpublished. Moreover, in depicting events associated with his Beagle travels, I decided early on in my research to accord primacy not to Voyage of the Beagle, but to writings created during his travels, his diary, field notes, and letters. Typically, those letters, colorful and robustly detailed, and often crackling with an immediacy unfound in Voyage of the Beagle, were sent to family members and friends. For further illumination, I also drew on the correspondence, memoirs, and diaries of others he encountered or traveled with during those years. Indeed, in drawing on the full breadth of Darwin's writings during those years, I discovered a spirit possessed of an energy and imagination that I did not expect to find. Moreover, I happily found that spirit not dissimilar to that which animates the best works of such writers as Lord Byron, Jules Verne, and Mary Shelley, and for that matter, even Homer and Jack Kerouac. To wit, beyond his expected interests in science and nature, myriad other topics enlivened Darwin's Beagle writings, including politics, missionaries, fashion, colonialism, race, slavery, architecture, women, South American and Australian cities, history, Tahitian royalty, gauchos, the British Empire, indigenous peoples, shopping, and cuisine. Moreover, his dispatch of those and other unexpected topics, in my view, showcase his often underappreciated gifts as a writer. Now, to return to our parade of misconceptions. Misconception number 4. Throughout his life, as the quintessential Victorian scientist, Darwin was bookish, reclusive, and singularly focused. Well, in 1839, a few years after his return, Charles married his first cousin, the former Emma Wedgwood. She was 30, he was 29. And over the coming years, they had 10 children, 7 of whom lived into adulthood. And during his middle and later years, Charles was often beset with illnesses. And those circumstances, growing familial responsibilities, and poor health kept him close to home. Indeed, after his return from his Beagle travels, he never again set foot outside of Britain. However, during his earlier years, including those of his Beagle travels, he was tall, lean, and fit. Moreover, he had diverse interests and exemplified robust, good health. Impressively, Between 1831 and 1836, at visited ports or places passed on overland outings, Darwin, then in his 20s, relished spending a few hours or an entire day climbing each area's highest mountain, whether in Brazil, Argentina, Tierra del Fuego, Uruguay, Chile, the Galapagos, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, or Mauritius. Beyond that, thanks to years of experience with firearms and mounted hunting excursions in England, he impressed even Argentina's gauchos with his marksmanship and savored extended journeys on horseback over often difficult, even dangerous terrains. Misconception number 5. The Galapagos produced the eureka moment when Darwin first conjured his theory of evolution. Well, that's a good story, and as Hemingway might say, it would be pretty to think so. But truth be known, for Darwin, his now storied 5 weeks in the Galapagos produced no eureka moment. In fact, he embarked on and returned from the voyage as a creationist, his belief in what he later called the fixity of species still intact. More to the point, only after Darwin's return from his Beagle travels and only after others had inspected the specimens he collected in the Galapagos did he appreciate the island-to-island species variance among the birds and tortoises he had gathered there. Indeed, while Darwin had nursed lifelong interests in natural history, his Cambridge degree, completed mere months before his departure aboard the Beagle, was the sort obtained by young men preparing for the Anglican ministry, the very vocation he had planned to pursue upon his return to England. Furthermore, after returning to England in 1836, he did not publish Origin of Species until 23 years later. Now, because the Galapagos are by now so widely viewed as the hallowed site where Darwin first conceived his theory of evolution, I want to conclude by saying a few more things about his time there. As I noted earlier, the Beagle spent just 5 weeks in the Galapagos, 5 weeks out of 5 years of global travels, 4 years of which were spent in South America. From the journal and field notes that Darwin kept in his letters home, we know that he was taken by the Galapagos, not only with its flora and fauna, but equally so with its myriad dormant volcanoes. But in truth, he saw nothing earth-shaking about the islands. For instance, none of his writings from the voyage even make mention of the famous group of avian species, Darwin's finches, whose differing beaks would bolster his later theory of evolution. Indeed, his diary's coverage of his Galapagos visit contains only one reference, and at that, a passing reference to any sort of finch. But if Darwin didn't write about the finches while he was in the Galapagos, he certainly collected them there, shooting and preparing specimens that he sent to England. But in a lapse from his usual fastidious attention to detail, and one that shows how little he was paying to island-to-island diversity, he commingled the birds, failing to record on their labels the specific islands on which each had been killed. Indeed, not until 1837 in London, after the expedition's conclusion and the bird's inspection by zoologist John Gould, did Darwin come to recognize the variations among the finches. Similarly, although Darwin noted and recorded the behavior of the massive tortoises on the islands, he failed to notice the differences among them until the Galapagos' governor brought them to his attention. And as with the birds, it was another scientist, the French herpetologist Gabriel Biberon, who had studied specimens from earlier Galapagos expeditions, who confirmed for Darwin those variances. Late in life, Darwin was asked directly whether he had been an evolutionist during his Beagle travels. "I believed in the permanence of species," he answered. "As far as I can remember, vague doubts occasionally flitted across my mind, but I did not become convinced that species were mutable until 2 or 3 years had elapsed." So, how then did the Galapagos become synonymous with Darwin's theoretical leap? Well, it just so happens that John Van Wy, a talented Cambridge-trained historian of science at the University of Singapore, recently traced the linkage. Initially, And for 50 years after Darwin's death in 1882, Van Wy observed, quote, most accounts of the origins of Darwin's theories attribute no significance to his visit there as compared to South America, close quote. Over time, however, the fact that Darwin's theory had eventually made use of Galapagos evidence morphed into a eureka moment. By Van Wy's count, in the early 20th century, about a quarter of publications referencing Darwin had him discovering evolution while in the Galapagos. Then, in 1935, the centennial of the Beagle's Galapagos visit, a group calling itself the Darwin Memorial Expedition added to the linkage. During a 2-year voyage, the party's members unveiled a monument on the Galapagos, on the island where Darwin had first gone ashore. The inscription read, Charles Darwin landed here on the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and his studies thereon led him for the first time to consider the problem of organic evolution. Thus was started that revolution in thought on this subject, which has since taken place. Later that year, a conference of British scientists ratified the connection, devoting an entire session of papers on the, quote, centenary of the landing of Darwin on the Galapagos Islands and of the birth of the hypothesis of the origin of species, close quote. As Van Wy writes, now for the first time, Darwin was widely represented as discovering evolution on the Galapagos. The title of this session alone was reproduced in newspapers throughout the world, close quote. By now, 200 years after Darwin set sail aboard the Beagle, the notion that the Galapagos chain is literally the birthplace of the theory of evolution is commonplace. Among scientists and other intellectual pioneers, however, such breakthroughs rarely arrive as blinding revelations. Instead, they tend to emerge from plodding, cumulative, laborious work, trial and error, even happenstance. And thus, for Darwin, there was no revelation in the Galapagos, no epiphany among the tortoises and the finches there. Much like the island's inhabitants, the scientist and the science had to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and informative, and definitely correct some things that I would have come in assuming about Charles Darwin and the voyage of the Beagle. Yes, as my colleague just added, do please add your questions in the chat. But Dr. Chaffin, since we were chatting ourselves a little bit before we got started, I want to reference one of those things to start us off. So you mentioned that you've been getting a good response to the book in general, but from a lot of scientists and science teachers. Can you talk a little bit more about what that's been like? Gratifying, I'm sure.
Oh, very much so. I think a lot of, I think most scientists and teachers of science, whether at university or lower, like high school, grade school even, they're familiar with Darwin's theory, and they may have read Origin of the Species, which was written decades after his return, but they're really not aware of the sort of groundwork that went into his work. I mean, I wasn't. For instance, in graduate school, I read Origin of the Species, and I kind of assumed. I actually bought a copy, a Penguin copy edition of Voyage of the Beagle that sat on my shelf for years until I've read it when I started working on this project. And I was surprised that that Darwin was I was surprised that I assumed that he had a more direct course into the sciences in his own career. The other thing was that that surprised me. I was not aware of all that he was. He really assumed he was going to make, if he made a name for himself, it was going to be as a geologist. I mean, he was equally or maybe even more fascinated by the earth. He witnessed his first earthquake in volcanoes in South America. I mean, he was fascinated with that, and he was equally fascinated by the thermal and volcanic activity that he saw vestiges of in the Galapagos, perhaps even more so than the flora and fauna.
Well, I think one of the things we learn about the scientific method, right, is that you at first see what you come intending to see, and then maybe eventually you see other things when you consider the data. I'm just going to toss in, because Mary Jane Kaplan earlier in the chat asked whether the library still has the copies of the books that our members would have checked out around 1860, the books by Darwin. It looks like we do not. We have some older books of his that are in our special collections, but they start with a copy of Insectivorous Plants, published in 1875. So that seems to be the oldest book by Darwin that we still have in the collection. There we are. So someone in the chat asks, how much was Darwin's slow approach to the understanding of evolution affected by his wife's beliefs, which were counter to his?
I don't think his. That's correct. His wife was, for religious reasons, not. I mean, she had very different views, but it was not so much that they affected his beliefs, but they affected his consideration of the making the beliefs more widely known. Initially, he actually, soon after their marriage, she wrote to him what I call in the book a kind of intellectual declaration of independence, where she was just basically saying, I'm not going to be converted to this view of the world, and beyond that, I don't even want to discuss it anymore. So, and when he first realized that the direction he was going, and started putting his words to paper. This is long before he published Origin of Species. He knew that he was kind of playing with dynamite, and he kind of he balked at he knew that I mean, the Darwin and Wedgwood families had very high social standing, and he knew that would cost him a lot reputationally in the milieu in which the family lives. And so at one point he not only balked at publishing, he sort of put he balked at publishing, but he also was to make sure that it finally did get out after his death. I mean, if he died prematurely, he actually had a manuscript copied and given to a friend in Shrewsbury, with and his will had instructions for how his Emma would publish books. So he was determined that it would someday get out to the world at large.
Can you talk a little bit?
One more thing.
Yes, please.
What finally sort of got him to the point of publishing it was learning that Russell Wallace, he had some competition. His mentor, Charles Lyell, probably the most famous geologist of the 19th century, who was his mentor, learned that there was another guy who, working in Malaysia, had basically the same theory, and so it's basically told Darwin, if you want to have credit for this, you need to finally get this out. And that's precipitated putting his words into what became Origin of Species. Anyway, excuse me.
So peer pressure then, huh?
Yeah.
Can you talk
professional ambition?
Professional ambition would be, yes, both nicer and more accurate way of putting it. Yes. Can you talk a little bit more about the ways that Darwin's personality changed as he grew older? And maybe I'll just append a separate question. Did any of his children grow up to have a strong interest in or a career in science?
Um, I that I'm not fresh on. I mean, I didn't really focus on his later years, but I know that uh, yeah, I think multiple generations of Darwin's descendants have gone into the sciences. Actually, his son Leonard, I know, was I think was a biologist.
Mhm. I suspect the questioner asking about the personality changes as he grew older is thinking of the segment of him saying he used to like music and now he doesn't have that anymore. He used to. Is there anything else to add about that point, which I found kind of sad, I guess, maybe rewarding ultimately.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of sad. Actually, this just occurs to me. When I was a journalist, I spent a week with Leonard Cohen in Montreal talking to him, and I remember something he said. I mean, I was in my 20s then, and I remember we were talking about some writer that he had admired, that he said he no longer could read, and he said, Leonard said, you have to, you give up things that you love as you age. Now, that just occurs to me. This is sort of like what Charles was saying about and it also made me think of that quote from the Odyssey about how the gods don't give out all their gifts at once. I mean, he basically said that um, he basically had to give up the sort of Dionysian appetites of his youth to achieve the things that he did later achieved as a scientist.
Yes, indeed. Um, so, the participant comments that they had never heard of the people from Fuji, I think. I'm sorry, I have the word
Voyagians.
completely wrong. Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for
Yeah.
saving me. And that story, I suspect that may refer to an article that you published recently, right? Was that story well known at the time? And did other voyagers bring indigenous people back to Europe? I'm going to pop a link to that story in the chat.
Yeah, it's in the Daily Beast. It's an excerpt from the book. Yeah, I didn't want to. I could have lectured on that tonight. That actually was. It's. I'll try to recap it briefly. The the first Beagle expedition that took place a year or two before the one that Darwin accompanied. It consisted of two ships, and while one of them was anchored at Tierra del Fuego. This was after Fitzroy, after the first captain, commander, had committed suicide, and Fitzroy had taken his place. Anyway, the Beagle carried I think 10 or so open boats, and some indigenous people in Tierra del Fuego had stolen one of the boats, and to facilitate the return of those boats, the Beagle crew kidnapped several Fuegians. That's what they called them. And the other Fuegians never came to rescue their the others, and so. And Fitzroy could not find they sailed off, and he couldn't find a place to land them, or this is what his story is. And at some point decided there were four of them, and he finally decided, well, we'll take them back to England and civilize them by instructing them in Christianity and British culture. And then one of them died of I think smallpox shortly after the return. And then he enrolled the other three in a private school outside of London. But then Fitzroy became increasingly he felt guilty about that. He was a devout, very conservative Whig, And then but when he had kidnapped them and brought them back, he was assuming that there would be a second Beagle voyage commissioned right away. So he was that his scheme was sort of predicated on that idea. But then the Admiralty showed no interest initially in outfitting another expedition. So Fitzroy at that point decided he would take them back himself, book passage on a commercial ship, and find a way to get back and repatriate them in Tierra del Fuego. And then, lo and behold, through political connections, his uncle, an uncle's political connections, a second Beagle expedition was commissioned. So, so the members of that expedition, or they included these three Fuegians, and Darwin from the beginning was fascinated by them, and he was also it's sort of it's sort of too lengthy to get into here, but it was a very they eventually did repatriate them, and that was actually and it was a Darwin at that point, that may have been the most fascinating transaction of the entire voyage from Darwin's perspectives, and he later wrote about it extensively in the Descent of Man, which was published in the 1870s, a much larger book than Origin of Species, and really a lot more ambitious than Origin of Species. But that was in part the episode that he gave short shrift to in the passage in my lecture where he says, Captain Fitzroy explains this, so I'll defer to him. But anyway, yeah, that passage, the excerpt in the current Daily Beast deals with that.
Yeah, it's very it's a really powerful excerpt, I think. And you're talking about it now makes me think reasonably well of Fitzroy. I mean, do you find him largely an admirable figure? And also someone asks, what about his writings? Did he talk about Darwin?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to give away too much of the book here. I mean, they had a very complicated relationship that was sort of hot and cold. And as far as the personal stuff with Darwin, he didn't really address those issues in his own narrative, nor did Darwin in his own books. He did fault Darwin when Darwin first turned in what became Journal and Remarks, and the book we now know as Origin of Voyage of the Beagle. He chastised Darwin for failing to give recognition to the officers and other seamen of the Beagle for credit in helping them, which actually I think is a valid criticism. Darwin he has lots of admirable qualities, but he tends to be, for my money, kind of loath in not acknowledging help he gets from different. I'm talking about like mentors who helped him along the way, other scientists.
Interesting. Yeah. So presumably Darwin did make some geological discoveries on the voyage. You talked about his experience of earthquakes and volcanoes. Is there anything that stands out from those results?
How do you mean?
The question I have here is just what were some of his geological discoveries on the voyage?
Well, he mostly was amplifying or finding confirmation for theories that Charles Lyell had concerning the origins of the Earth. Lyell, as well as Lyell was Scottish, and there was another Scottish geologist of an older generation named James Hutton, who they were both known in their age as as being among the first to challenge what was called the biblical or Mosaic account of the history of the world. I mean, prior to those two individuals, geology was mostly about vindicating the biblical account of the creation of the world in Genesis, which means, I mean, there was a common view that the earth had been created by one common estimate 6,000 years. So the geologists' work, that the tasks that the geologists saw for themselves is finding evidence, is confirming that. But Hutton and Lyell sort of figured out that it was a much larger canvas and much more time have been required. And so Darwin was for the world to be created, and so Darwin, or the planet, and so Darwin was just sort of basically seeking confirmation of that. Actually, one of his more fascinating things, the other thing is he bumps in the Andes, he bumps into a petrified forest, and he's just fascinated with that.
Yeah, boy, you could see where somebody from the British Isles that would be incredibly.
Yeah. Also, one other thing that comes to mind, if like I said in my talk, that he really wasn't involved with the survey that was being conducted, but he did get interested. He often would watch the guys conducting it, and he became fascinated with coral reefs. And that became for him a kind of, it's coral, basically it's rock and animal. So for Darwin, that becomes a kind of bridge between those two disciplines of geology and biology. And he's just fascinated with coral. And I think actually that becomes his first academic paper, book on an essay on coral reefs.
Well, I love that idea that it's the bridge between the geology and the biology. It's a critter that's also a rock.
Yeah.
Perfect, right? Good. So I think we have time for a couple more questions, if that sounds good to you, and kind of move towards wrapping up. So audience members, if you have anything else to add, now would be a good time. Regarding Darwin's journal entries about cuisine or slavery or other, to him, peripheral topics, are any particularly interesting?
Well, he's, his particularly on his the Wedgwood side of his family, and his grandfather Josiah Wedgwood had initiated a tradition in that family of being a philanthropist, a lot of philanthropy, particularly giving money to abolitionist causes. So that becomes that was very important for Charles. And early on in their, I think it's in Rio, he has a conversation with Fitzroy, with a visiting captain from another British ship, who goes on about the horrors of chattel slavery, and Fitzroy sort of questions that and says that that he's exaggerating or whatever. And then, anyway, that leads to a kind of blowout between the two for a while, which they soon buried the hatchet. I mean, I think there was a mutual recognition that they had a long voyage ahead of them, and so they needed to find a way to get along. I mean, Darwin later in his autobiography characterizes Fitzroy as pro-slavery. I think that's overstating. I think I don't think he was pro-slavery, but I think he was. He wasn't as he didn't have Darwin's zeal in opposing it either, and he was sort of more tolerant of it, I guess, is one way of saying. Excuse me.
Yeah, that is an interesting and obviously a very divisive topic for that era and later eras. But yeah, so did anyone else who had been on this Beagle voyage write anything that has survived?
Oh yeah, a number of them. No major books or anything, but they're. Um, you mean published writings or?
Oh, published or just that are accessible outside of scholarly resources, perhaps.
Oh yeah, and actually that gives me a chance to plug two excellent websites that allowed me to do this book during the COVID lockdown. The Cambridge University has a wonderful site called the Charles Darwin Online, or Darwin Online, excuse me, um, that has every probably every shred of paper that Darwin ever um, wrote on, as well as correspondence from, this is like transcribed materials. Actually, in some, they also have many of the originals online too. But it's not only Charles, but his relatives and associates and colleagues and mentors and everything. And then at the University of Singapore, there's another really good website called Darwin Online that's actually operated by the historian Van Wy. I quoted extensively in my talk. That has every publication of Darwin and many on by or about him, including some recent ones that are perhaps out of copyright or whatever, and also translations from or no foreign editions. So yeah, the Darwin's a subject if you're interested in. There's a lot online.
Brilliant. I did just pop the links to those two resources in the chat, so do check those out. That sounds terrific to just kind of muddle around in a little bit and find some wonderful things. So I kind of have one more question to perhaps close with. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Dr. Chaffin, that hasn't yet been said this evening?
I can't think of anything. I mean, I will as soon as we disconnect.
Isn't that always the case?
No, but again, I think also I wanted to bring up the we discussed before the I'm not a scientist, but I was saying this book, I think of it as the English major's Darwin. I mean, that's my background. I mean, that's what I studied. Yeah.
Yes, I that really makes sense to me as a more of a humanities-oriented person with an interest in science for a popular audience. Put a face on it, and it helps a lot.
Actually, I did think of one thing. Actually, I was about his relationship with his father, Robert Darwin. His father was a kind of aloof figure. I mean, Charles respected him, but they were really on sort of different wavelengths. And Charles, by his sort of adolescence, I mean, his father was quite worried that he seemed to have no direction in life. That he was kind of, I mean, he collected things, but he was also enjoying like just hunting and riding and those kind of activities. And at a certain point, Dr. Darwin basically made him like an intern in his own practice, where Charles was actually taking patients and mixing up medicine. He talks about and Dr. Darwin at that point says, well, I think the kid's got what it takes, and decides he's going to ship him off to Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh's medical school, to follow in the family tradition, becoming a physician. However, he stayed there about a year, and it turns out he was squeamish. He couldn't stand the sight of blood, so he washes out of that. And then Dr. Robert Darwin says, well, you've got to do something with your life. And then he comes up with this idea. Well, you can become a parish priest. We'll will enroll you at Cambridge University. You can become a parish priest in the Anglican Church, and that way, I mean, you'll have a respectable position in society, nice sinecures, company housing, that sort of thing. And as was common, I mean, with a lot of Anglican priests that day, in their spare time, they pursued, when they had a lot of spare time, they could pursue interests in natural history. Actually, a lot of the prominent geologists of that day were also priests. So that was, and then the invitation to join the Beagle comes along, and his father thought that was just a awful idea that would just encourage his son's wayward ways, and initially says no, and then he says, well, if you can persuade your uncle, Robert Darwin was very close to his uncle Josio Wedgwood. He said, if you can persuade him that it's good, I'll go along with it. And so Wedgwood, he goes over and spends a weekend with Wedgwood, and their entire family thought that was a great opportunity. And so Robert, true to his word, relentingly relents, and the rest is history. Anyway, I just wanted to.
No, that's fantastic. Somebody comments, and I agree, these details about Charles' relationship with his father are wonderful. Thank you. That's very good. So do you think that Darwin would be surprised that we're still talking about him today? Or do you think he realized he was going to be immortal in a way?
I think by the time of his passing, he knew his stature. I mean, he was very famous. I mean, internationally famous.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Audience members, do purchase your copy of Odyssey. Do learn more about the library, fill out our survey, other great things like that. Thank you so much, Tom Chaffin, for being with us this evening. And we will hope to see you online and or in person with your next book, potentially.
Well, my pleasure, and I thank you and everyone who's tuned in tonight. Take care and stay safe. Good night.